The Girl Scouts Canoe Trip, Chapter 13, Prisoners. All Friday afternoon, Frida and Marjorie watched eagerly for the return of their jailer, or for some trace of the scouts, but no one came near. By supper time they were worn out and disheartened. They knew that they must spend the night at the farmhouse. They were not, however, overcome by a sense of physical fear. The old people seemed slightly crazy to them, but harmless. They slept a little late in the afternoon, and finally were awakened by their captor's summons to supper. Again they had a wonderful meal placed before them. The woman, it would seem, was ashamed of her husband's actions, and was doing everything she could to make up for them. In spite of herself, Marjorie felt a sort of liking for her. "I suppose you may as well tell us your name," remarked Marjorie, as she spread out some delicious peach preserves upon the tempting hot muffins in her hand. "Our name is Higgins," replied the woman, lowering her eyes. "And yours?" "I'm Miss Wilkinson. As you know, my friend is Miss Hammer." There was a silence for a few moments while they ate. Both girls realized that even now the scouts were probably eating something like canned salmon and beans while they enjoyed a chicken dinner. But they said nothing. Marjorie made up her mind not to utter a word of praise of Mrs. Higgins' cooking. "It's evident," she remarked sarcastically, "that you people never had any chicken." A faint flush spread over the woman's face, and then a tear came to her eye. But she looked down hastily at her plate to hide her embarrassment. "No, we never did," she replied. "But how did you know?" "No mother or father could be so cruel," answered Marjorie cuttingly. The thrust hit deep. The older woman was silenced. The girl had touched the tenderest chord of her heart, and now she was fully ashamed. She would have abandoned the whole project had she dared. She was so completely on her prisoner's side. But she was afraid of the old man. He might do something desperate to them all if she went back on her word. And even now she realized that she too was a prisoner, just as much as the girls were, and in her own house. "What do you think can be keeping him?" asked Frida, refusing to dignify such a contemptible creature with a name. "I don't know," replied the woman. "Perhaps the telephone is out of order, or maybe he's took sick." Fresh peach ice cream and a wonderful chocolate cake failed to produce any sort of comment on the part of the girls. Marjorie thought she never tasted such delicious cooking in her life, but still she said nothing. Mrs. Higgins sighed. She so seldom had anyone to cook for, and it would have meant so much for her to have her efforts appreciated. "I think there are some games in the table drawer in the parlor," she told the girls, as they rose from the table. "You're welcome to play with them." Frida went in and got them, but Marjorie went straight to her room. Throwing herself upon the bed, she sobbed bitterly. "Why do you suppose old Higgins isn't back?" she asked, as Frida entered their bedroom. "Probably he couldn't get your father," said the other. "Are you sure he would be home?" Marjorie thought for a moment and then started to weep afresh. "No, he wouldn't," she exclaimed. Then brokenly, "Mama and Papa were going away this morning for a week-end party, and Jack is camping. Oh, Frida!" Her voice died in a wail of woe. Frida sat down beside Marjorie and drew her head to her shoulder. She let her cry for a minute or so, and then tried to calm her. "Nothing awful can happen, Marjorie," she said soothingly. "We'll only miss a few days of good time at the most, for something is sure to happen. The real Marjorie Wilkinson that they are looking for will turn up, or old Higgins will reach your father by phone, and he'll come hot-foot himself. Or the scouts will send a rescue party, or—" Marjorie smiled faintly through her tears. "You are a great comfort, Frida. I don't know what I'll ever do without you. I suppose there are worse things than missing the meet and a few days at Silvertown. Bah, oh, I was so eager to go." "Of course you were. Well, let's don't worry yet. Why, there are 4 whole days left, and it only takes 2 to get there. My, wasn't that wonderful chocolate cake, though? I could almost love old Lady Higgins for that. I hate her, cried Marjorie vehemently. She's just as much to blame as the old man. Maybe not. Maybe he rules her completely. Some men do, you know. Well, I'm never going to get married then, announced Marjorie. Come, this won't get us anywhere, interrupted Frida. Let's play flinch and try to forget it. The girls played until nearly 9 o'clock and then decided to go to bed, worn out from the mental strain. They felt grateful for the comfortable bed, soon fell asleep, clasping each other's hands. There's nothing so effective in cementing a friendship as a common misfortune. They slept late the next morning and were awakened by a knock at their door. It proved to be Mrs. Higgins with a tray. "Good morning, girls," she said cheerfully. "How are you today?" Both girls suppressed their natural inclination to say something pleasant, and Frida, with a suggestion of her old rudeness, asked, "Is that old man back yet?" Mrs. Higgins shook her head sadly. "Not yet, miss. Maybe the telephone's broke." "Is your pap likely to be home, Miss Wilkins?" "No. He and Mother went on a week-end motor trip. Of course he won't be able to get them." "Why didn't you tell him that?" She set the tray on the table by the window. The breakfast, fresh peaches with cream, hot biscuits, eggs, and fragrant coffee, certainly looked inviting. Marjorie eyed it critically. "As a matter of fact, I forgot," she replied icily. "Well, more's the pity for you. If I know Mr. Higgins, he'll stay right on the job till he gets an answer. If that's the case, you needn't hope to get away till your parents come back." Marjorie's eyes flashed in anger. "You're wicked, cruel people," she cried. "And when my father hears about it, he'll have you put in prison. So there." "But he can't," objected Mrs. Higgins. "We're only trying to help the police catch a runaway gal." "That's obeying the law, ain't it? Not breaking it." Marjorie was silent, and the woman opened the door and went out. The girls turned to their breakfast. "I won't eat her food," exclaimed Marjorie. Then suddenly, with a flash of inspiration, "Frida, let's go on a hunger strike, like the woman suffragettes did. They wouldn't dare let us die." "But in the meantime, the meat would be over," objected Frida, proceeding to the table and pouring cream over her peaches. "No, Marjorie, that won't do. We'll think of a better plan. Come eat your peaches." Her companion, however, did not stir from bed. Frida carried her own peaches over to the window and sat upon the broad sill to eat them. Gazing idly out, she noticed a slender lattice, which led up to the window, and an arbor underneath that was the solution of their problem. Her eyes lighted up with the discovery. "Marge," she whispered excitedly, "there's a lattice and an arbor just outside our window. We can easily escape." The other girl was out of bed in an instant, looking eagerly out the window. Frida was right. The structure, frail though it was, looked sufficiently strong to support their slender weight. "Let's do it right away, Frida," proposed Marjorie. "Oh, you are a trump." She seized her companion and hugged her. "Shh," cautioned the other. "No, I'd love to go right away, but I really think we'd better wait till dark. Won't it be wonderful to give the old man the slip?" "Perfect," agreed Marjorie. "Gracious, Frida, it just seems as if I couldn't wait." "Well, you must, and let's stuff all the food we can, for most likely there isn't any left in our canoes, and we have no money. Are you good for a 2-day fast?" "I'm good for anything, if we only get away, and I believe we must." The girls dressed and spent the morning wandering about the house and looking at some old books and magazines, the latter of which had evidently been current during Mrs. Higgins' youth. They asked continually for news of her husband, but always received a negative reply. They managed to look annoyed and to preserve in the presence of their captor the same sullen attitude which they had assumed at the beginning. At noon they ate a particularly hearty meal, and then retired to their room to take a nap, for they felt that the chances were that they could get little sleep that night. It was while they were laying down and just beginning to doze off that Miss Phillips and Ethel came in search of them and held a conversation with Mrs. Higgins through the window. But they were utterly unconscious of the whole proceeding. They awakened a little before 6, just in time to get ready for supper. Again they ate heartily, and inquired with concern for the old man. "You needn't expect to see him before Monday, or Tuesday, or whenever your pap comes home," Mrs. Higgins repeated, "for I know he'll stick to the end. They's a nice hotel at Beasley, and he has cronies there. In fact, he often goes off for several days at a time." "And leaves you all alone?" demanded Marjorie indignantly. The girls went to their rooms after supper, announcing their intentions to go to bed early. Mrs. Higgins, too, decided to turn in as soon as dishes were done. Marjorie was just on the point of offering to help when she reconsidered her idea and decided it would be wisest to let things stay as they were. Marjorie and Frida watched the sunset, and the deepening twilight from their window kept a sharp lookout for Mrs. Higgins. When it was finally quite dark, and they had heard the stairs creak as Mrs. Higgins went to bed, and all was still in the house, they cut the netting of the window with Frida's scout knife and prepared to descend. Frida went first. With the end of the bed sheets tied around her waist, she put one foot upon the lattice. Then, finding that it supported her weight, she descended cautiously, step by step. Fortunately for her, and for her companion as well, both girls wore sneakers. It was a more difficult matter for Marjorie to follow, for she had no sheet to protect her. But knowing that Frida, who was heavier, had arrived safely, she made the descent boldly. In a moment they were on the ground together. "Free at last!" They stopped to untie the sheet, then hurried noiselessly on. Their sneakers allowed them to advance rapidly, and in absolute silence. In a short time they reached the water's edge. But here they encountered difficulty. The canoes were gone. "Of course," whispered Marjorie. "We might have known the miserable wretch would think of that. Never mind. We'll beat him all the same. Let's swim across. I know there's a path on the opposite shore, and we'll be less likely to be caught." Fortunately, the night was warm, and the girls felt no shock as they plunged into the dark water. They were both exceptionally good swimmers. Otherwise, the weight of their clothes might have seriously retarded their progress. "I've never been in swimming at night before," remarked Marjorie, as she made her way rapidly through the water. "Oh, I have heaps of time," said Frida. "Do you suppose we'll take cold?" asked the other a minute later. "Not if we walk fast. And let's. I'm not a bit tired, are you?" "I should hope not, after the afternoon sleep. Let's hurry and not lose a minute." They found that the path was plainly visible in the moonlight, and they walked as fast as they could, glancing nervously over their shoulders now and then, as if in fear of pursuit. Chapter 14. The Last Day of the Trip. It was after 10 o'clock when Miss Phillips and Ethel finally dragged their canoe upon the shore, where the rest of the scouts were camping. In answer to their call, the girls all appeared at once, but they did not need to ask the news. The failure to find Marjorie and Frida was plainly written on the countenance of the searchers. Lily Andrews, who had forced herself to keep cheerful all day long in spite of her increasing fears, broke down at the captain's first words and sobbed uncontrollably. "Not a trace," sighed Miss Phillips, from the depths of a disconsolate weariness. "I just know they have been drowned," wailed Lily. "No, I don't think that," replied the captain. "They are too good swimmers." "Tell us all about it," begged Alice, also beginning to cry. "No, wait," protested Frances gently. "Remember, Captain Phillips and Ethel must be starved and so tired. Come and eat first. We have something nice all ready for you. Then, when you're both a little bit rested, you can tell us the whole story." Miss Phillips gave Frances a grateful look, and the whole party went to the tents, where a bright fire was burning. "It was lovely of you to wait up for us," said Miss Phillips, taking the tin plate Doris handed her. "We couldn't any of us have slept a wink till you did come," said Ruth. "We were so excited and worried." The two ate silently while Ruth and Doris aimed to keep up the spirits of the party by relating some of the trifling incidents of the day. Miss Phillips finished her tea and returned to the girls. "There unfortunately isn't much to tell," she said sadly, and then proceeded to relate her conversation with the woman at the farmhouse. "We took her advice," she continued, "and made the portage which she suggested. It was a short-cut. Possibly it saved us a mile or so. Then we went very slowly, looking everywhere for a canoe and calling at intervals, and whistling the troop call. Once we saw two girls in the woods, and our hearts fairly stopped beating. But then they came nearer, and we realized they did not look anything like our girls. Then, as soon as it got dark, we went faster, calling the girls' names, however, as we went along. Twice we stopped people, farmers, to ask if they had seen anything of the girls, but we got no information. And so, you see, our only hope lies in what the woman reported that the girls said, that they would press on and try to beat us to Silverton. I devoutly hope that's the case, and I'm inclined to doubt it, for if somehow does not sound like Marjorie Wilkinson. But Captain, put in Ruth, "Marge really isn't such a saint, even though you think she is. I've known her to play jokes on people before, practically when it is sort of like a game, as this is, and wouldn't harm anybody." "But it harms me," sobbed Lily. "I'm scared to death about her." "No, Lily, don't be that," urged Miss Phillips. "You mustn't give up yet." "And don't forget," said Ruth, "that Frida hammers with Marge, and the whole idea may be hers." They discussed the matter with animation for a little while. Ruth could hardly keep down the feeling. She was so delighted in knowing that her plan was working. She had, however, one dreadful scare, a contingency which she had never once thought of. It was Ethel Todd who suggested it. "Captain Phillips," she said, "in case the girls have been delayed by a leak or an accident of some sort and are not in Silverton, couldn't we postpone the meet until Saturday?" Ruth became white to the lips. Suppose her whole scheme should fall through for such a reason, and after so much success. In the moment that eclipsed, while Miss Phillips considered the proposition, she suffered agonies. But at last the answer came, and relieved her. "I wish we might," she said, rising, "but there are so many events planned at Silverton that if we want the lake and an audience, we have to ask for a date months ahead. No," she concluded sadly, "the thing will have to go on, unless, of course—" "No, no, don't say it, Captain," cried Lily, in distress. "Let's believe nothing dreadful could happen." "I hope not," said Miss Phillips. "Suppose we turn in now, girls, so we can get an early start tomorrow." "And see Marge and Frida and Silverton all at once," exclaimed Ruth. The cheerful tone of her words brought a ray of hope to those less optimistic. Miss Phillips had expected that, in accordance with their schedule, they might reach Silverton by Saturday night. But this, of course, was now impossible, and a wire on Sunday morning preceded them to announce their arrival for 5 o'clock. All day long they paddled steadily. At first they seemed silent and rather depressed, but as they neared Silverton their excitement increased, and they grew more and more hopeful of finding their lost companions. It was Ruth Henry who encouraged this spirit, rejoicing inwardly at the disappointment they were soon to encounter. She was glad that she had managed to include Frida in the scheme, for she had never cared for the country girl, and was thankful for an opportunity to put her in her place. As she said, it was ridiculous of Miss Phillips to think of allowing such a person to take part in an event at Silverton, and she was pleased over the chance to exclude her. But Frida and Marjorie, and, in fact, all the other scouts, would be forever unaware of the real cause of the adventure. 1 hour more, observed Lily, looking at her watch, and we'll see Marge. 1 hour more, said Ruth, and we'll see our house in Silverton. 1 hour more, echoed Doris, and we'll know who is giving our wonderful trip. 1 hour more, added Miss Phillips, and we'll get the surprise of your life. Oh, what, Captain? Asked Ruth, with intense interest. Or perhaps I had better say surprises, she corrected, for there will be more than one. The creek had become wider now, and it was more difficult to handle the canoes. But the girls put forth great effort, even succeeding in increasing their speed, so anxious were they to reach their destination. The scenery was lovely now, and then there were attractive bungalows along the water's edge. The girls watched impatiently for signs of Silverton. We shall approach the town from the rear, observed Miss Phillips, so we will not get the best view. And how are we to know? Asked Frances. We shall see the big lake joining the creek, and then in a minute or two we'll see it. As I have said before, the whole place isn't very big. When the canoes actually came to the lake and approached, as Ruth said, the Isle of their dreams, they were surprised at how little of the town they could actually see, for on the shore towards the creek the trees were large and close together. Only the roof of the church, or a particularly high house, was now and again visible above the trees. 2 luxurious machines stood on the bank, and the girls looked intensely to identify the drivers. Lily was the only one to recognize one of them, for both were chauffeurs. "That's our chauffeur," she cried, in consternation. "Yes, and one of those is our cars, too." "Well, of all things, Lil," exclaimed Ruth, "how do you suppose—" But Lil was already out of the canoe and was running towards the chauffeur. "Henry, where did you come from? Are Mama and Papa here? Have 2 Girl Scouts arrived here before us? Where—" Henry touched his cap and smiled at this breathless storm of questions. "Yes, Miss Lily," he replied. "Mr. and Mrs. Andrews are here, and you will see them in a few minutes. And there are some young people who arrived yesterday." Lily gasped in astonishment, and the others pressed closer about her and the chauffeur. "But they are not girls, they were—" "Shh!" cautioned Miss Phillips. "Not a word about that, please. It's a surprise." When Lily finally learned that Marjorie and Frida had not arrived, her eyes filled with tears. She stood still, as if she wanted to get into the canoe again and go back. But Miss Phillips told the girls to get into the machines. "But who will take care of our canoes?" asked Ethel, who had no desire to lose them a second time. "One of the men will be right along, miss," explained Henry. "You needn't worry." The machines drove for a short distance along a dirt lane, which seemed to go right through the heart of the woods. When they finally emerged, the girls beheld a smooth white road lined with beautiful bungalows and houses, all in the most perfect condition. Green lawns dotted here and there with flowers, enclosed by hedges, surrounded the lovely dwellings. "And is our house as lovely as these?" asked Ruth, impressed by the splendor of it all. "Just a minute, and you can see for yourself," replied the captain. At these words the car slowed up and turned abruptly through an open gate and up a wide curving driveway, which led to a charming house of the English type. It was low and rambling, but very large indeed. At first glance it seemed to the girls to be almost the size of their dormitory at Miss Allen's. On the wide veranda of the house the girls could plainly see a group of people, apparently all men. No, there was one woman in the center of the group, and it was Mrs. Andrews. "But who are they?" questioned Ruth, turning to the captain. "Some of the Boy Scouts," replied the latter, "and Mr. Remington and our benefactor and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews." But amid the noisy, happy greetings that followed, there was a great note of sadness. Marjorie and Frida were missing, and with one exception, no one knew what had happened to them.